The classic comic strip character and super cop Dick Tracy is known for having one of the largest and most grotesque rogues galleries in all of fiction. In fact, his rogues gallery is even collectively referred to as grotesques. Many of them have some kind of bizarre deformity or disfigurement. This aspect of the Dick Tracy rogues gallery was of course beautifully brought to life in the 1990 Dick Tracy live-action movie. Since their physical deformities are what the Dick Tracy villains are most well known for, I figured it would be a pretty cool idea if I made a video where I listed the 10 most grotesque looking Dick Tracy rogues of them all. And so, well, here we are. Now, this is not a top 10 list. I'm not gonna rank them from least grotesque to most grotesque because that would be pretty difficult. Instead, I'm just gonna bring them up in chronological order, the order they first appeared. And so we start off with Scardoll, who first appeared in 1939. One of the earlier, truly grotesque-looking Dick Tracy villains. Scardoll was a pretty petty crook who robbed gas stations. I mean, most of the Dick Tracy villains were pretty low scale. They usually weren't trying to conquer the entire world, they weren't straight-up supervillains. As you can see, Scardoll here looks pretty weird. He's got a giant forehead covered in freckles and tiny creepy eyes. He also has an unusually large underbite. Yeah, truly a freaky looking little fella. And we now move on to our next grotesque, which is Prune Face. Introduced in the middle of World War II, Prune Face was a Nazi agent with an incredibly wrinkled face, despite actually being a young man. The reason for this wrinkled face is reportedly a skin condition. Prune Face is of course one of the more famous Dick Tracy villains, arguably his second biggest villain after his arch nemesis Flat Top. And Prune Face has appeared in numerous other media outside of just the comic strips. In these various adaptations, he's usually not depicted as a Nazi agent as he was in the original strips. Instead, he's normally portrayed as a mobster. And we now fittingly move on to Mrs. Prune Face. That's right, Prune Face's wife, Mrs. Prune Face. Her face doesn't really look like a prune though. Instead, she's disfigured in a pretty different, although equally maybe even more so, horrific way. Mrs. Prune Face was disfigured by getting a can of gasoline thrown in her face. And the result was this bizarre looking skeletal mug. What a lovely couple they make. Mrs. Prune Face was introduced in 1943 and tried to get revenge on Dick Tracy after he'd killed her husband. Our next weirdo is Influence. Introduced in 1946, Influence wore special kinds of contact lenses that he used to hypnotize and mind control people with. And he also happens to look really grotesque. If I were to describe his lovely mug, I would perhaps say that it sort of resembles a cross between a skull and an ape. Yeah, I think that's the best way to describe Influence's mug. This handsome face was of course one of many to be brought to life in the 1990 movie. Our next rogue is Wormy. Wormy Marans. Mr. Marans was introduced in 1949 and was a vicious killer who often committed crimes alongside his wife, whom he also abused. So yeah, quite a nasty fella, and his face is equally nasty. It has a worm-like pattern all over it, like he's got worms all over his face, or inside the skin of his face. I don't know. Wormy everybody. Our next freak is Nothing Jansen. We've now reached the mid-50s. Nothing Jansen was introduced in 1955. Jansen was a criminal and the owner of a nightclub and has, as you can see, a tiny face. Now there is of course a more famous Dick Tracy villain who also has a tiny face, Little Face, and he was actually introduced before Nothing Jansen, already in the early 40s. I chose to include nothing over Little Face on this list because, while yeah, sure, Little Face does have a little face, Nothing's face is so little it barely exists. I don't think, in all my years, I've seen a person with a smaller face than Nothing Johnson. And our next grotesque rogue is Rodent. Rodent was a petty crook and the leader of a small gang, and he had a face that resembled a rat's face, as you can clearly see. Now, we've seen other characters in comics with rat-like faces. For instance, the Ratcatcher from Batman has a sort of rodent-like face, but I mean, that's nothing compared to this. This is literally a man with the face of a rat. Why does this man have a rat face? How did he get this rat face? Nobody knows. Rodent was introduced in 1959 in the comic strips, but he's probably most well known for his small but memorable appearance in the 1990 movie, where again his bizarre visage was brilliantly brought to life with the amazing makeup effects. And we move on to our next villain, which is Half and Half. Half and Half was a criminal who was hideously disfigured on the left side of his face. He also wore two-tone suits to... Wait a minute. This seems kinda familiar somehow. Haven't I seen this guy before somewhere? Somewhere else? Introduced in 1966, Half and Half is indeed a shameless Two-Face ripoff. And no, before you ask, he did not flip a coin. In fact, Half and Half was pretty much just a pure evil villain and had none of the pathos or psychological complexities of Harvey Dent. I will definitely say though that, at the time at least, Half and Half's scarred mug certainly outshines Harvey Dent's. I mean, for the 1960s, the Silver Age of comics, that is some grotesque looking scarring right there. It looks like a melted candle. Our next hideous rogue is Piggy Butcher. That's right, Piggy Butcher. Introduced in 1967, could this guy be the original Professor Pig? Well, probably not. Piggy Butcher was a crime boss who ran a car theft racket, and he operated out of a farm, yeah. And as you can clearly see, he has an extremely grotesque looking face that really resembles the face of a pig. It almost kinda looks like he's had way too much plastic surgery done on him. And now for our final rogue on this list, and fittingly enough, we happen to end it on perhaps the most grotesque Dick Tracy villain of them all. The Pouch. And here he is. Ladies and gentlemen, the Pouch, or simply Pouch. Now Pouch here, good old Pouchy, actually has an explanation for his weird appearance. He used to be really overweight and was even part of a sideshow attraction. And then he lost a bunch of weight, leaving a ton of hanging skin flaps. Yeah, that's why he looks like this. The truly bizarre part is though what he does with these skin flaps. He hides items in them. Pouch is a smuggler and uses his skin flaps to smuggle things. His front is that of an innocent balloon vendor at a zoo. I'm not really sure though if anybody would wanna approach this guy and buy balloons off of him. Introduced in as late as 1970, you can clearly tell that Chester Gould was going completely insane by this point. I mean, we had some pretty freaky rogues on this list, but Pouch here. Good old Pouch, Pouchy, he really takes the cake, doesn't he? Yeah. Even for Dick Tracy standards. If Chester Gould wasn't going insane or going senile at this point, I refuse to believe that he at least wasn't high on crack. I mean, it was the groovy 70s after all. And there you have it, the 10 most bizarre and grotesques out of the Dick Tracy Rogues Gallery. Truly some remarkable and completely insane villains here for these comic strips. Let me know down in the comments what you think of these lovely guys, and did you know any of them before, or is this your first introduction to them? And of course, as always, Arkham Asylum awaits you in the next video.